All right, today I'm going to do a reaction video of a video named "Is Richard Carrier Finally Cooked?" And you can't see it here, but the thumbnail has a picture of Richard Carrier, and it says, "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV." I watched this yesterday. I had some comments. The maker of the video had some comments back, and so now I'm reacting to the video, but we'll just get into it.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for checking out this channel, and thanks specifically for checking out this video, because I think we have an interesting topic on the chopping block for today, which is the mythicist interpretation of Jesus. The main thing that we're going to talk about today is the idea that Jesus was purely mythological and that there never was a historical Jesus. We're going to talk a lot about the main torchbearer for this idea, so the main proponent of this mythicist school of thought, and that's Richard Carrier. He wrote a book called On the Historicity of Jesus, and we're going to review that book. Now, some of you may be familiar with this set of arguments. However, there is, I think, some important and relevant stuff that's going to precipitate out of this debate that I think is going to have some really particular poignancy that I'll focus on at the end of the video. One of the things that I will do in this video is I'll use chapter settings. So if there's a part of the video that you want to skip ahead to, you can skip ahead to whichever part of the video you want to get to. Because I think there are some lessons that will be able to distill out of this debate that are really important and more broadly applicable. All right.
Sounds really insightful. Yeah, let's talk about On the Historicity of Jesus book review.
So a brief introduction. We're going to talk about On the Historicity of Jesus, which is a book by Richard Carrier. That's the main book that recently has popularized the notion that there never really was a historical Jesus and that the story of Jesus was pure mythology. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my own qualifications to address this question. But first, let me address the channel in general. I just want to note that we're a new channel. We're very young and we haven't been doing this for very long. So I would love it if you give this video a like. So please click the like button. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. As a young new channel, that really does help us out tremendously. If you click the bell icon, that'll make sure that you get notified about future videos.
I did it.
The
I
most
did the
important
thing
thing to me is please comment on this video. Many of you who watch this channel are really very educated in a lot of different areas. So I really appreciate the discourse that we've had in the comment section. I read each and every comment myself, and I respond to every comment personally myself. So if you want to weigh in on the comment section, I think that'll be really intellectually enriching for me. All right, so a little bit about me. I want to talk about why I decided to weigh in on Richard Carrier's perspective on Jesus as a myth, and just talk a little bit about what my academic perspective is. So I've said this in some other videos, but it is particularly relevant for this video, and that's that I'm a university professor. I'm a professor at a major university on a tenure track. Okay, now I'm not a professor in any field related to the historicity of Jesus. So my expertise is definitely not in this field, but I do have a set of skills for academic criticism. So in other words, I have editorial experience in the major journal in my field, and I'm also one of the top rated reviewers for that journal. So since that journal kept records, I'm one of the most prolific and most recognized reviewers for the main journal in my field. Now, because of this, I have kind of a more honed perspective on academic rigorousness and intellectual scrupulousness. So that's the skill set and value system that I really want to bring to bear on Richard Carrier's arguments about the historical Jesus. So that's just sort of a brief introduction to my set of qualifications for why I think I'm able to have an opinion on this topic and whether or not that opinion matters. All right, so
I think that goes into other stuff. Oh, hold on.
Let's talk about first all the reasons why we think.
Okay, cool. Cool. Since he's talked about his background, I'll talk about mine first a second, so you can decide whether or not my opinion matters, or whether I, as he said, allowed to have an opinion on things like this. Kind of interesting. So I am an atheist. I used to be a Christian for for my young life. I was a Christian. Super diehard Christian, Wednesday night Bible study, Sundays. My mom worked at the church, so I was lived at the church like most of the time. Broke away from that, studied occult stuff for a while. I have a deep knowledge of the occult, and more recently, where I guess around 2011, I watched some YouTube videos of Richard Carrier, who wrote this book, and I pretty much, that was it until more recently when I started talking to my Christian friends, I got the books and actually read through them, or I listened to on the historicity 1.5 times. I listened to Proving History 1.5 times, and I listened to the pop market version, which is what's it called? Jesus from Outer Space, twice. So that is the background history. Oh, and I guess I like talking about. I have no interest in like taking anybody's faith away. Um, uh, uh, I in fact I don't even think Jesus being a myth. Uh, I think you can still believe that and still be a Christian. I think obviously the original, or at least some portion of the original Christians um, believed this, basically. Not that he was a myth, but that he was like a celestial being. Anyway, we'll move on.
Jesus was really a historical individual. Now, there's two main arguments that we'll go into, and then we'll go into sort of individual citations. Maybe the first and most important main argument is that the consensus opinion of almost every scholar is that Jesus did exist. Okay, so almost
Cool. First thing, everybody believes that Jesus existed. Appeal to consensus, that's fine. You know, you can appeal to consensus, is okay. But you should have more of an argument at this point. Not saying he doesn't, but there's many things that we all thought were real at one time, and then consensus is not an argument. We move.
every historian, from an atheistic to a Christian side of the spectrum, apologists and atheists alike, all believe that Jesus really was a historical individual. It's not often that we have that degree of agreement among all scholars. Now, as far as I could tell, when I looked into the current status of academia and historical academia specifically, as near as I can tell, there is no historian and there's no professor of history anywhere in the United States or Canada with a university affiliation right now who believes that Jesus was purely a mythical character. So every current academic historian in the United
And again, yeah, he's going to go on this for a minute and we'll watch through it, but just because everyone believes a thing doesn't mean a thing isn't or couldn't be real. Richard often states a lot 10, 20 years ago, when the guy made the book about questioning the historicity of like Moses and the patriarchs or whatever, everyone, didn't believe, and now it's like the mainstream consensus. So we move.
United States and Canada right now all believe that
Oh yeah, too. If I had a bigger budget or more technical know-how, I would have timers up on the screen of anytime he's appealing to authority or attacking the person, not the argument, or ad hominem. So if you're watching, just pay attention to, is the thing that the guy in the video is saying addressing an argument that the person is making, or is it appealing to authority or attacking the person and not the argument?
Jesus was in fact a historical individual. So I thought that was interesting, and that just goes to show how far the historical consensus around the historicity of Jesus has evolved. Now, the other important thing that I want to note is that we do have very early attestations from antiquity from the Jews, the Christians, and the Romans, who all attest
We do.
and endorse that Jesus was a real historical individual. Now, that's important because there are not a lot of sets of agreement in the ideas between ancient Jews, ancient Christians, and ancient Romans from antiquity. But in this case, we do have agreement between all three parties. So,
I don't
by
know
way
about
of
that.
contrast, let's look at the evolution of the mythicist perspective of Jesus. So, this is a set of arguments that didn't really get advanced until the late 18th century. I'll put some names on the screen and some names of works that surfaced in the late 18th century. So, in a very modern, very recent time span, this argument surfaced. And it surfaced from some French philosophers, not necessarily historians, but rather philosophers, who posited that maybe some of the stories about Jesus were adopted from mythology. So from that argument, that has sort of evolved a little bit into the current tradition that Richard Carrier is advocating, and Richard Carrier is the most vocal advocate for this school of thought that Jesus never was a historical individual. So we have a very recent, very modern set of arguments, and I guess my point here is to just emphasize that we should probably trust some of the early historical records from antiquity more than more recent, very modern arguments about Jesus that emerged not necessarily from historians, but rather from philosophers.
Super interesting you say this, because we actually have writings from early Christians. Well, actually, I don't know how much writings we have, but we're aware of Christians within the first 200 years of Christianity that believed that it was a myth, or that he didn't actually come down, and it was like either an allegory or he was like a celestial being. We know this because of things like on the heresies. It talks about, yeah, these things were deemed heresies, and so yes, we don't have their writings, but we have people writing about them, and we know that they believed, early Christians believed. So we're not taking we're not throwing away all the early ones. We're using the early ones, in fact, the earliest ones, Paul. But we'll get onto that.
So I think that's an important thing to note. And again, I've shown on the screen some of the French philosophers who originally sort of devised this argument that Jesus was heavily borrowed from mythology. All right, now what we're going to do is kind of zoom into some.
Jesus was borrowed from mythology. That's a little bit different than what I was talking about, but we move.
Of these resources to determine the degree to which we can trust some of these historical voices that endorse the fact that Jesus was a real person, at least at some point in time. So we'll talk briefly about the Christian literature. I won't dwell too much on this because many of you are already very familiar with the set of arguments probably, but we have the letters of Paul and we have the Gospels, and most historical scholars agree that the Gospels are at their core biographies that are theologically shaped, but they are meant to tell the narrative of a real person who existed. We also have a set of embarrassing details.
I'm going to listen to that again.
Are meant to tell the narrative of a real person who existed that are theologically shaped, but they are meant to tell the narrative of a real person who existed.
I mean, I disagree. Is he saying that
many of you
people
are
agree?
Very familiar with the set of arguments probably, but we have the letters of Paul and we have the Gospels, and most historical scholars agree that the Gospels.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, most historical scholars agree that the Gospels. So again, appeal to authority, appeal to consensus.
Are at their core biographies that are theologically shaped, but they are meant to tell the narrative of a real person who existed. We also have a set of embarrassing details.
Before we get into that, so I mean, I disagree. I think at least in Mark, it's clear to me anyway that he is probably even like writing in a way to convey that these things didn't happen, that the reader would know, like, okay, so there's heavy symbolism in this. The famous one is the fig tree. Jesus, is about to go into the temple. He sees the fig tree. It doesn't have figs on it. His disciples tell him, it's not the season for figs, but he gets mad and curses it. He goes in, throws the tables in the temple. He gets really mad and comes out, and the fig tree is like withered. And it would make no sense if this is an actual event that happened. It would just make Jesus seem crazy. But if you take the symbolic meaning of it, that the fig tree is a symbol for the temple, and that that it's not the time for, it's not the season for figs anymore. It's not the season for the temple anymore. This perfectly makes sense. This would not happen in reality for a lot of reasons. One of which is people don't curse fig trees and they don't wither. But beyond that, even if you believe that somebody could do that, that just it would make the face narrative makes Jesus look crazy, where the actual thing. There's also things like everybody in the story names are what they do. So Jesus Christ literally means like Savior God, and you know, he he's brought before the Jesus ben Damnius, or I can't, the other, they let another Jesus go just to parallel Yom Kippur. So at Yom Kippur they let a goat or sheep or whatever go out into the wilderness, and they sacrifice one in or around the temple, and so this is perfectly paralleled in the story, that it has two goats, one Jesus Christ, supposed to be Son of God or whatever, and Jesus, I forgot his Ben Damnius maybe, but apparently that's supposed to mean son of the Father. So this is mythical telling. I think these are clearly described in this way to show that they are. But anyway, we move
to tell the narrative of a real person who existed. We also have a set of embarrassing details within those documents. So there are things that are hard to explain if you're conceiving of Jesus as purely a mythological story. In other words, if Jesus was de novo a myth, then why would you put in things like the baptism by John? This becomes kind of a hard and embarrassing detail to explain. So
I don't think it is really hard or a detail to explain. The book, I don't know if you did read it. You don't have a picture of it, but the first part of this 2-part book is proving history on Bayes' theorem and the quest for the historical Jesus. This one doesn't deal too much with the Jesus question as much as it does to lay out his method of using Bayes' theorem, but it goes fully into why there's a general inadequacy of the criteria for embarrassment, and it has plenty pages, and it's clear that if you had read this, it'd be clear that it's not hard to argue from. In fact, it actually makes a lot of sense if you're trying to if you're trying to historicize a deity, you want to throw in some, like if I'm making a deity, I want to throw in some embarrassing things and make him look like an everyday kind of guy, or like North Korea, I think, could learn from this. If they allowed their great leader to, use the bathroom like the rest of us, maybe be a little bit more believable. But we'll move on.
If Jesus was mythological and purely mythological, why would Jesus need to be baptized by John? We also have a discussion of the rejection.
Yeah, so why would he need to be baptized by John? I'll just look, at least in Proving History, there is a several-page commentary on why this specific criteria is not always great, but some specific inadequacies of, and it goes over the Roman crucifixion, which are actually, or Jesus being crucified by the Romans, which we'll go over in a second. The birth of Jesus in Nazareth, which is like a kind of like a podunk town, like why John's baptism. Jesus's ignorance of the future. That's another embarrassing thing. Why wouldn't you read it out or write it out? But there's a lot of reasons in the book. It just seems like you're unaware of any of these.
Of Jesus by his family. We have endorsements of family members that we'll come back to in just a moment. But why would you put in the idea that Jesus was rejected by his own family as a divine figure. That's not something you would put in if you were devising Jesus as purely a mythological story. You
Not
also have the crucifixion.
not necessarily. Jesus is asking, or at least in some of the Gospels, Jesus is asking, to turn away from your own family and to join him as a new family. So it would only make parallel sense that Jesus's family rejected him. But we move.
Fiction. Now, Richard Carey does have some responses to this. His thesis is that the crucifixion was really a celestial or metaphorical event, but the way it's portrayed in the Bible is very clearly a very humanizing, very mortal episode that was very painful for Jesus. And it's hard to imagine.
So yes, the way it's portrayed in the Bible, but you're missing, and I do not believe that if you read the book, you would be missing his point on this. Richard Carrier's point is that the Gospels that have that excruciating image of Jesus on the cross and all his lead up to his execution and all that was, 50 years after the things that they were describing. And so Richard mostly uses what Paul talks about, and Paul doesn't seemingly know about any earthly crucifixion. He's not crucified by the Romans. He's crucified by the powers and principalities, which is a kind of a term for celestial demons. It doesn't seem like Jesus is being historicized until way later, and our first writings have a very celestial take on it. They're in all of Paul, which is like most of the New Testament. Paul doesn't know about any disciples. He doesn't know about any travelings, any teachings. He doesn't know, all the things you would expect from somebody that, if all these things were going around, for instance, you'd say, oh, well, he just didn't believe in those things. Well, I don't think I don't think anybody believed in him, because Paul is kind of constantly arguing with people in what they should or shouldn't believe. And so whether he believed him or not, he would at least have to argue against them. And we don't even have any evidence that he or anyone else before the Gospels, some 50, 60, sometimes even I'm saying 50 for the first, Mark, our first Gospel, even starts to historicize him. And I don't think, even in Mark, he necessarily believes in a historic figure. Seems like it's symbolism. It's not until later in Luke and John. It's funny, and it might be a little bit of a side, but not all the Gospels even just show an excruciating execution. They call it, I think, John the passionless passion. But anyway, I've rambled.
Imagine why you would have an excruciating, very human depiction of death if you were writing about Jesus in a way that was metaphorical. The whole blood and...
Well, also another reason why you'd have a very human depiction of death is that, in my opinion, Mark, and this isn't just my opinion, was an adoptionist. So, there's no birth narrative in Mark. He becomes God at he gets the Spirit of God on him on his baptism by John, and then he gets crucified. He says, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And in the Greek, it says the pneuma left him and the Spirit left him, and then he dies suddenly. So why would there be excruciating human? Because he was a human that, or at least as far as Mark believed, was a human that took on the Spirit of God, we move.
Water line. And that was actually endorsed by an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 1987, which described what physiological changes we might expect to see in somebody who was crucified. So that was a paper that came out in 1987, and that endorsed that, if you stabbed somebody after they were in hypovolemic shock, you would get not only blood, but a combination of blood and effusion as well. And that's the blood and water analysis that comes out. So again, this was a very human, very mortal depiction. Hard to justify if you're conceiving of Jesus purely as something that's mythological. Another important argument is that we do have early creeds about Jesus that we find in the New Testament. So these are phrases in the New Testament that seem to be written to be easily memorized. So these are
Cool. Pre-Pauline creeds. Most scholars date these creeds to several months to 2 years after the death of Jesus.
mnemonic devices that we find in the New Testament. These are probably creeds or various passages that developed within a few months of Jesus' death and probably not more than 2 years of the death of Jesus. So these were very early on beliefs about Jesus. That's probably a little bit too early for a story to develop into a mythology.
Okay, well, what are these? What are these early pre-Pauline stories? Or these songs. I don't think there's any historicity necessarily any historicizing going on in these early things. Let's go.
Some of those early proclamations include the pre-Pauline Creed from 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Again, this is a set of phrases about Jesus that has meter and verse.
All right, Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of them whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. I don't see how this... and again, I feel like this almost even does the opposite. This only shows him showing up to people after he died, but we move.
We have Romans 1, 3 through 4, which is also a mnemonically formed hymn. We have Philippians.
Okay, well, concerning his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Cool. There's nothing in this that, as a mythicist, I would disagree with, or like this doesn't go against anything.
2, 6 through 7. This is also a Christ hymn with a very distinct structure compared to the other passages.
Who was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born with the likeness of men. Cool. This isn't born with the likeness of men. Yeah, like this all maps perfectly onto the mythicist paradigm, if you will.
Around this part of the Bible. We also have 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 26, which is an account of the Last Supper. So
23, for I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. 24, that's just the thing. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took up the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood. Do this. I offer you to drink it in remembrance of me. As for often you eat this bread and drink of this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Cool. We have Jesus telling people to eat and drink in remembrance of me. Doesn't require. Yeah, this is perfectly okay, or matches the mythicist perspective. I just had a thought too. What was it? Um, oh yeah, you're talking. It's. I guess you'll talk later about Romulus or whatever, but another dying. Which at the time I think you miss some stuff about or don't say some stuff about Romulus, but yeah, they're having communion for Romulus, another dying and rising god in Rome, the supposed bringer of the kingdom of Rome, in the context in which this Corinthians is being written. But we move.
So a lot of the early proclamations in the New Testament about Jesus that ascribe Jesus with a very human form are written very early after the death of Jesus, probably a little bit too soon for mythology to form, since it's within months to no more than a couple of years of the death of Jesus.
Pretty too soon for mythology to form. Well, I mean, if we just assume that mythology has to form out of something, and then it goes into, then it can only grow into mythology. But you're just assuming that things can't start as mythology and grow into something more. It's interesting too. Bart Ehrman doesn't. Another scholar that your quote later is as thinking that Richard Carrier is a bunk or whatever. Um, I've read a lot of books by Bart, and it's interesting. It's like so many of the things that I've learned from the books of Bart's, um, kind of coincide with my understanding of what mythicism is, but he just refuses to believe. I don't know why. Um, I was thinking about this the other day. It almost feels like we're all looking at the same set of like facts, and it reminds me of like. This probably isn't a perfect analogy, but it reminds me of like why we think the Big Bang happened, and so we can look out at the stars and we see stars moving away from each other at a certain speed, and they're moving away from what seems to be a central point. And so if you just like back up time, you can see all this matter kind of coming together at one point, and then you have to, okay, how did it come out? Well, it had to be pushed out by some large force. Okay, what kind of force would that be? Well, if all this matter was on top of each other, and so it's kind of that's a long way to describe it, but I kind of see this all this same information that like Bart and non-mythicists, super anti-mythicists see as it goes out here, and all I see is that I'm taking that same information and kind of moving back, and it just seems to all be pointing at mythicism. Sorry that was a long-winded analogy, and it's probably not a perfect one, but anyway.
To form, since it's within months to no more than a couple of years of the death of Jesus. Let's zoom in a little bit on the writing of Tacitus too, because this is probably one of the most recognized sources about the historicity of Jesus. So this is a quote on the screen from Tacitus: Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. So here Tacitus is attesting to the fact that Jesus was indeed a historical figure. He led this movement, and they became the Christians. That's what.
So, I mean, I guess you can have that thing, but this is in no way, this is in no way proving like that Tacitus believed, or meant or had any reason to believe other than like this like he could get all this information from the Gospels, for instance, which were all written by this time, or for most part, maybe the last ones, Revelations, maybe not, but yeah, like so none of this is independent from the Gospels. So yeah, anyway.
Tacitus is, that's the historical background that Tacitus is giving us here. And it's clear from this passage that Tacitus believes that Jesus was indeed a historical individual. We also have the writings of Josephus in Antiquities, for instance, 18:3.3. Josephus advocates that Jesus was indeed a human individual. He had a human brother named James. That's something that comes from Josephus. So it's hard to imagine that Josephus would be so quickly after the death fooled into accepting a mythology in place of an account of a real person. We also have letters by Pliny the Younger.
Um, so, uh, you don't go into this, and it is baffling that you'd say you've definitely read this book, and so this is what you would make the video about. You'd be like, well, um, Richard says he doesn't believe the things in Josephus written about Jesus were actually written by him. He thinks they're later additions. This is where it'd be an interesting point, but you don't. You just you submit these as evidence, where the book that you're reviewing in this video submits them as evidence without talking about how the other. Yeah, I don't know.
Younger Lucian of Samosata, and we have some other traditions that I'll go into in just a moment. But I first want to acknowledge the way Carrier addresses Tacitus and Josephus, and the way he addresses them both is by saying they were not contemporaries.
This is what I'm talking about. There's no reading of this book or this book that would make you think in any way that the reasons that Richard dismisses any of these, Josephus, Pliny, excuse me, Tacitus, was because they're not contemporary. Let's go. I actually just lost the page. That is not his point at all. It would be clear if you had read the books, or maybe I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you just don't remember. There's a big book. There's a lot of stuff in here. But assuming you've read the book, you have the book, and you could go before making this video to find it. So we'll go to extra biblical evidence, which starts on page 280. There's a bunch of stuff in here, but we're talking about Josephus. Starts on 332. Goes over the Testimonium Flavianum. Just fully goes through page after page after page on why we don't think that he wrote Josephus wrote the Testimonium Flavianum, or the other passage where he talks about the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ. He goes through page after page. First reason we don't believe this. Second reason we don't believe this. Third reason we don't believe this. Fifth reason that it looks like Josephus talking about James is interpolation of Acts, I think. Just flat out wrong on like so many things right here. It's not that they're not contemporary. It's that we and then okay, so next
With Jesus, he does have some other criticisms, but
Tacitus. You mentioned Tacitus and Pliny. No, it's not that they're not contemporary or not. What did you say? Yeah, they're not contemporary. It's not that. It's that they can, page 345. And this is after. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but to wrap up the thing on Tacitus, accordingly, we cannot verify that the information in Tacitus comes from any source independent from the Gospels, and non-independent evidence carries zero weight. And again, yeah. Anyway, we're moving.
Main criticism is that they were not contemporary with Jesus, and therefore they don't get to have an accurate first-person impression of what Jesus said or did, or whether or not he was real. Now, the problem with this is if you look at historical scholarship throughout time, historians are often writing things about times before those historians themselves existed.
Again, this is a straw man. This is evidently clear. We don't throw out things people write because they weren't there. But yeah, anyway.
Effectively. So in other words, we expect that historians would write about the years before those historians were born. That's just something that goes on throughout history. That doesn't necessarily mean that we discount every historian who wasn't an eyewitness to the events that they're describing.
It would be absurd if we did that.
We don't have that many historians from antiquity, so we do treasure the ones that we have. Now, I think
We definitely don't have any historians in the Bible.
Carrier's point is we can't tell with complete metaphysical certainty that Jesus did 100% exist. But if we throw out the existence of Jesus as a non historical event, then we essentially have to throw out a lot of history. And I think to do so really leaves us without a lot of intellectual enrichment that we get from academic history.
Absolutely in no ways means we need to throw out anything in history. Yeah, I don't even think it requires us to throw out a lot of things, even in Christian history. You know, like all of these things can have metaphorical or allegorical or spiritual meaning. There's, it seems an absurd reach, again, a straw man, to knock down.
So I think it's important to not throw out some of these attestations to the historicity of Jesus. And again, if we sort of weigh those against the viewpoints of historians or other thinkers who thought that Jesus was purely mythological, then we have those other more mythological ideas about Jesus emerging very, very late. So that should make them at least less trustworthy than the much earlier sources.
They're not very late. I went over this, some of the earliest Christians, including Paul, and in my view, but even if you don't agree with that, the 200s, you know, I think I could be wrong, but it's definitely before the 300s. We have people believing that he was a myth, and that you know, you might call them the Gnostics, and you might be disagreeing with them, but you know, that's fine. But they were early, and they were there, and they believed he was mythical in a sense.
That Jesus did indeed live as a person. So I'm not going to go through all the quotes about Jesus from all historians, but I do want to briefly mention the Toledot Yeshu. The Toledot Yeshu.
This is an interesting thing. I'm not. It definitely could be in here. I'm not aware of Richard ever talking about the Toledot Yeshu. Let me know if I'm wrong on that. But it's. I remember you talking about it. It sounds like an interesting thing, and it just would be an interesting thing to maybe prove the historicity of Jesus. You could do that, and maybe. But again, this is as a book review. We've talked about like nothing so far in the book, and now we've said, yeah. Now we're just going to something else. Let's go.
It was an interesting resource about Jesus for a few reasons. Number one, most people who have studied this book agree that, and by the way, there are hundreds of different versions of this book, and essentially the Toledot Yeshu is a disputation of Jesus from the Jews. So this was essentially the Jewish writings about Jesus that were meant to portray Jesus in a very, very negative light. Most people who have studied this set of books agrees that it probably goes back to the second century at the latest. So it could be a tradition that's earlier than the second century. We don't have any copies that are that early, but we do have copies in various different languages. So there's about 8 different linguistic traditions and hundreds of versions of the Toledot Yeshu. And I've made a whole video about this, but you can do sort of a cladistic or semitological analysis of the Toledot Yeshu to determine how early the oral tradition behind the Toledot Yeshu is. And most historians think that this is based on again, there's most historians who have studied the Toledot Yeshu specifically. Most historians think that this was a very early set of rabbinical teachings about Jesus. So, and the Toledot Yeshu, interestingly, assigns Jesus with a patronym. So, in other words, they call him Yeshu ben Pantera. That means Yeshu, the son of Pantera. Pantera was a name of a Roman soldier. This is a very deep dig at Jesus, and it's obviously meant to pejorate Jesus. But the point that the Toledot Yeshu is making here is that not only was Jesus an illegitimate son, not only was Jesus a bastard son, not only was he an illegitimate son of an actual human being, but he was an illegitimate son of one of the worst types of humans that you could be, according to the Jews in that area, which was a Roman soldier. The point is that the Toledot Yeshu clearly says that Jesus was born of a human being. By the way, the reason why they selected the name Pantera is probably because of its similarity as a word to the word Parthenos. Parthenos is the Greek word that essentially means from a virgin. So, in other words, the Toledot Yeshu is sort of making fun of Jesus here by saying, yeah, he's born from a virgin, but that's because he was born by a Roman soldier who was his illegitimate father, and that guy's last name was Virgin. So, in other words, saying, yeah, he's born from a virgin.
It's interesting. I mean, okay, I don't know. It's just it's interesting that we're choosing this as a way to say that he was historical. So is this true? Is he? Was he? Does this have any knowledge of the truth of the matter? And if that's true, then he was the son of a Roman soldier. Seems kind of weird that.
But he's born from a dude whose name was Virgin, and that's why the Toledo Yeshu calls him Yeshu ben Pantera. This is a very deep, scathing dig towards Jesus, and this phraseology is also used in other Jewish works from antiquity. In fact, even the Talmud itself talks about Jesus who was hanged on the Passover. So this is almost certainly a reference to the same Yeshu ben Pantera that's mentioned in the Toledo Yeshu. And the Toledo Yeshu also affirms that, Jesus who was hanged on Passover is a phrase that shows up often in this work. So we have a very high degree of certainty that the Toledo Yeshu is describing a human being. They're assigning him a patronym. They're assigning him specifically an illegitimate birth. And they're also, describing this as clearly a human being, an individual. All right, so that is the set of historical documents, just in brief, that address the fact that Jesus was indeed a historical figure. Now, let's turn our attention to the arguments that Carrier makes. And we're going to talk about his arguments, and then we're going to sort of develop a critique of his book on the historicity of Jesus. All right, so one of Carrier's
Let's critique his book.
main arguments, and one of his best known arguments, is the degree of similarity between Jesus and other mythical figures. Now, most historians have already sort of explained this away and said that most of the similarities that Carrier is mentioning are in fact very superficial at best. Now, Carrier lists a whole long
I'd like to see a citation on that.
laundry list of mythological figures, and there's just not enough time in a video to go through each and every one of the figures that Carrier mentions. But the one that he spends the most time on is Romulus. So let's talk a little bit about Romulus and the differences between Jesus and Romulus. So, all right, the first important
The differences don't matter. It's how they're the same that matters. It's how if for a moment you can think about you read this whole book supposedly, and you're saying for a moment think about how a historicist would think about this. So the person who is making up the myth would be picking from, I don't even know where I was going. It's I don't know. I'm baffled. I'm sorry.
difference is that Jesus is grounded in historical realism versus Romulus, who exists only in mythical times and places. So that
Romulus is only born in mythical times and places. Ancient Rome. That's both not a mythical time or a mythical place. He founded a city. That's another place. Founded Rome. That's also not.
there are actually dates that are given around the life of Jesus. Romulus never had any dates. Romulus never, in his own mythology, interacts with real individuals. Jesus, at least, we know, interacts with individuals who are real. We know, for instance, Pontius Pilate was real. We know that Herod Antipas was real. We know that Caiaphas was also real. Romulus, by contrast, doesn't interact with any real historical sites or real individuals. We also have the death of Jesus versus the death of Romulus. Jesus' death is depicted as a public execution. With Romulus, we have a set of different deaths depending on which set of mythologies that you go with, but most of them end in a mysterious disappearance of Romulus. Now, this is important because if you take away the death of Jesus, you lose a big part of the narrative about Jesus. So saying that, the death is different, but they're otherwise similar is kind of a hard argument to make.
I don't understand how that's a thing. The point of it is the difference. That I don't know. I don't understand. I don't even know how to communicate that. It's yeah.
We also have Jesus who interacted with multiple witnesses versus Romulus being interacted with in his own mythology as a sort of a single vision appearance. We also have Jesus who had ethical teachings. Romulus did not have any ethical teachings. So Romulus is not depicted as a rabbinical authority. There's no ethical core of what Romulus was saying. Jesus is at the very least depicted as an ethical teacher. So there are a lot of very deep differences between Jesus and Romulus, and this is the mythical character that Carrier spends the most time on. There are other other Carrier.
I don't know if that's true, but it doesn't necessarily even matter. Like Romulus, okay, maybe he spent the most time on him, but it's not the point. This isn't even like necessarily the nail in the coffin argument. This seems known. Like there's, Inanna was a dying and rising god 1,000 years before Jesus. Like, the son of a god. What is this? I don't understand. Also, yeah, that's the embarrassment criteria. Like, why would God not do this first? Who was that? Justin Martyr. Oh yeah, Justin Martyr's explanation of why there are so many gods like Jesus was that Satan knew the plan beforehand and came and had all these other ones so people would be confused when the real one came. Interesting. But yeah, we're talking, or I mean, that's one way to do it, but even your early Christian, Justin Martyr is wrestling with the fact that Jesus is similar in so many ways to so many deities that it's just plain.
Characters the Carrier throws out, but he lists basically every mythical character in all of antiquity. So it's really hard to go through all of them. So
Jesus
I'll probably
parallels
stop at that one.
almost
But
every
if there are more
mythical
questions about other
character
mythical characters
in
and their
history
differences between Jesus,
should
I can
be,
put those in the comment sections. But as many other historical scholars have echoed, there's a problem here because Carrier is taking very superficial similarities between Jesus and other figures and saying that those similarities are more similar than what they are. In my mind, this is a bit of an unscrupulous depiction of other historical mythologies in order to strengthen Carrier's case. Now, we'll talk about other problems with Carrier's analysis. One problem is that there's no peer-reviewed literature that cites Carrier's book. It's actually not true. There's only like 3 articles in the scholarly literature that I could find that cited Carrier's book.
Oh, so he has some.
That results in Carrier's book essentially being sort of an intellectual dead end.
Intellectually outpaced. Intellectual dead end.
Now, of the 3 sources that talk about Carrier's book, the largest citation and the most legitimate is Daniel Gelada in a journal article from the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. But this is a takedown of this book. So this isn't like, let's take this book, let's build on the knowledge base, let's publish other ideas around it. Instead, what Gelada does is he writes a very, very scathing review. In fact, I'll quote from Gelada later on in this video. But the point of this is that there's no body of literature that builds on Carrier's work. So let me give you this sort of a counterpoint of my own work. So I've written about, I think, 50 peer-reviewed papers. The biggest papers that I've written have been cited hundreds of times. So I think the largest one has been cited about 400 times. That means that there's 400 other people in my field who have looked at the papers I've written and said, this is important and I'm going to build on it by adding this point to it. And that's how a knowledge base grows over time. But what Carrier's done is he sort of, for whatever reason you can assign, he sort of created an intellectual dead end.
He's created an intellectual dead end. Why did he do that? He created an intellectual dead end. He did it. He did it. Other people not agreeing with him is him creating an intellectual dead end. That's so interesting.
Sort of a bit of a specific indictment on Carrier's work. I think it's also important to recognize that number 2, the other big problem with Carrier in general is that he has never published any scholarly journal articles on Jesus as a myth. So in other words, he makes his argument in the book that Jesus is purely mythological, but there's not a single journal article that he has ever written that makes the case that Jesus is a mythological
Not a single
figure.
journal?
So he's never put that in the actual proper journal, the journal-based scholarly literature. So that's surprising to a lot of people, but
wow,
that is a fact.
it's surprising to me.
Looked up Carrier's work in scholar databases. Carrier has published 3 different papers, but none of them have to do with the mythological perspective about Jesus. Now, just to underscore how small a body of work this is, of only 3 different papers, and it's really amazing that Carrier has parlayed just a very small body of work into...
Amazing, dude. It's amazing how bad and dumb and Carrier is. You know what? I heard he smells funny too. And I don't like curly hair.
Such a ostensibly successful career, maybe not in academia, but among the lay public. I think that's really impressive. Like Carrier
It's
is
impressive how bad he is.
Fanatical fan base.
Fanatical fan base, dude. It's impressive.
His fan base is based on his own sort of self-promotion. It's not based on his success as an academician. So 3 papers is not very much. And again, none of his 3 papers have to do with Jesus as mythology. His 3 papers that he put out, is a very small body of work. Just to give you some idea, almost every university for academic promotion expects you to publish at the very bare minimum 3 papers per year.
Bare
and often
minimum,
there's
dude.
standards that are much higher than
He
that.
just isn't.
So again,
He's
Carrier
not
has
cutting
made
it.
a significant
Mr.
contribution to
Carrier
the
isn't
academic literature.
carrying it.
And in terms of the scholarly, journal-based, peer-reviewed literature, Carrier has published 0 manuscripts in that body of literature. There's other problems with Carrier's approach to academia in general.
Damn,
he doesn't have any society
Bart Ehrman's blowing him out of the water.
memberships. The 3 big societies around early Christian scholarship would include the Society of Biblical Literature, the American Academy of Religion, and the Society of Classical Studies. I am a member of several professional organizations within my field. That gives me the opportunity to...
You know, that's what I've learned from this. That's what I learned, that if you don't, you can typecast people, and if they don't fit what you want, you don't even have to listen to their arguments. You can presuppose that they're bad. You don't have to address any of their arguments. And you can call them silly, and impressive how silly they are at creating themselves an intellectually dead end.
Interact with other professors, other academicians, and to talk over my ideas, and to also stay current with what's in the field. Carrier is not a member of any society.
What a loser.
Is he has essentially sort of been waging this war in a complete academic vacuum. So and by that I mean that a lot of people sort of say, oh, this is Professor Richard Carrier, and he gets introduced as Professor Carrier. And
You think we could brainstorm if we were just like playing devil's advocate, and we had to brainstorm some reasons why it might be hard to get these things published or become part of, organizations for the study of the Bible. What do you think if we could come up with any reasons to steel man it on the other hand, as opposed to straw man it? Do you think we could come up with any reasons and why the people that study the Bible don't want Richard's stuff? Well, I don't know.
a lot
Maybe
of
not.
lectures that I've seen.
Maybe we can't figure
but
out
he's
anything.
not a professor. He has never held a single academic appointment anywhere. He does have a PhD, so he has a degree. So he was a grad student at one point, and he graduated from grad school, and that's an accomplishment.
He's not a professor. And if you look at the thumbnail of this video, he's not even a doctor, dude. He's got a PhD, but he's not a doctor.
To diminish that, but he's never been in an academic rank. He's never had a tenure track position.
What
And
a loser.
It's not super hard to get these positions. In other words, if Carrier had really kept at it and contributed more to the academic literature, he probably could have gotten a professorial position at some point. And by the way, it's not terribly hard to even publish in the scholarly
impressive.
literature. So it's a
It's not
little
even that
surprising that
hard.
Carrier has made 0 contributions on his main
Zero
thesis to the scholarly
contributions.
literature. That's and it's alone is surprising. A lot of people don't realize that Richard Carrier is also not a professor. He's not a professor. He's never been a professor. And like I said at the beginning of this video,
He's also
there's
not a
no
tank.
professor who currently has an academic appointment in the United States and Canada, at least that I could find, who believes that Jesus is mythological. Now, Richard Carrier does make a big stink about saying that his book is in fact peer-reviewed, but there are several problems with this perspective.
Damn, his book
So
isn't
the
even
book is put out by a very
peer-reviewed.
small publishing company. It's, I think, called Sheffield Phoenix Press. So this is a very small publishing company. In fact, the biggest book that they've ever put out is Richard Carrier's own book. So this is essentially just one step above vanity publishing.
Oh,
this
damn.
is not
So wait,
publishing
it
by a big
isn't
publishing house.
peer-reviewed?
If you look at the 3 academic publishers, I've written books for at least 2 of these publishers. It's Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley. And just to give you some idea of what their scope and scale is, each one of those big publishers
I bet it's a big
has
scope and
peer-reviewed
scale,
database
dude.
of hundreds of
I bet your
thousands
scope is
of
super
individuals.
big.
Sheffield Phoenix Press,
Tell me
near
how
as I
big
can
your
tell
scope
based on
is.
information online, has a group of maybe a few dozen reviewers at most. So it is a very, very small publishing company. Now, the reason why their small number of reviewers is important because this raises questions about how the blinding process was. Now, there's also some overarching problems with self-promoting, putting out a book, and saying that it's peer-reviewed.
Okay, so we're,
And the
I just
biggest
want to say,
problem
we're
is the
like
following.
20
When I
minutes
put out an
into a
article in the
37-minute
peer-reviewed
video,
literature, that
and we've
article gets
talked
put out
about
if editors like
maybe
it,
3
reviewers like
points
it,
that
then the article
the
goes into the literature,
book
and then other
made,
people can read it,
and none of the points were accurate to the book. I don't think you read the book. You said you read the book. You had to been listening to this while you were doing something else. There's no way. All of it, like you could have. You maybe missed a couple points. I get it. You know, you could misremember some stuff, but like almost, I can't think of one thing that you've been right on, as far as representing his thing. This whole video.
people can cite it.
This is getting too long.
However,
it's an hour now.
If I were to write a book, and I put that book out under
This whole
like a
thing
very
is just
small
like a
publishing company,
takedown. This
I
should have been a
deal where I
review
get-
of Richard Carrier, not a review of his book. You don't like him. He's a big poo-poo head.
kickbacks for every book that's sold. Now, the whole point
people
of
shouldn't listen to
academia
him.
is to sort of
And so you don't have to listen to him. I get it.
mitigate those monetary incentives to like say things that are more sensationalized or things that will accumulate a large audience from the lay public. For instance, you could imagine a setting where I said, here's my evidence that aliens exist, and I put out a journal article about that. A lot of people are going to be interested, and a lot of people will download that article. And if it appeals to the lay public, then a lot of people, then that idea can slowly sort of catch on over time. But when you put out a journal article, you're not supposed to have any financial incentives associated with your publication in that scholarly journal. So now there's people like Bart Ehrman who put out journal articles and books, and they sell their books. I think that's a sort of different issue. I'm not going to be as critical about that in this video
Because
but
we
the
like
point is,
Bart Ehrman,
Carrier
or we
has
agree with
only
Bart
put out
Ehrman on
one
this point.
work that
We're not going to be
advocates
as
that
critical.
Jesus is mythological, that is at all even arguably peer-reviewed, and I think that's a hard argument to make.
It's not even
And he's
peer
never
reviewed.
made
It's a hard argument to make that it's actually peer reviewed. It's not real. He's not a real doctor. It's not real peer reviewed.
Any arguments in the actual peer-reviewed scholarly literature, in my opinion. So as a result of that, I think you have to take his arguments with a big, big, big grain of salt.
Damn.
It's also very problematic that Carrier has statistical analysis in his book, and yet he doesn't incorporate any analysis from an actual
gonna speed this up.
statistician.
This is going
just
on
to give you
too long.
some idea of what the academic standards are. Whenever I have a paper that I put out that has a lot of statistical analysis in it, I will actually get feedback from a statistician at a university who looks over my work and says, yeah, this is correct. And then that statistician will either be acknowledged in the paper or will be added on as an author. Now, Richard Carrier does have some statistical analysis in his book, but it's very problematic. He uses Bayesian analysis. Now, I don't want to lose too many people, so I don't want to talk in too much detail about what the statistics around or what the statistical basis of Bayesian analysis is. But
We
I'll just
don't
say that
want
it's
to
a
get
way
too
of sort of,
technical.
generating what the diagnostic utility is of a test, right? The problem with Richard Carrier is he puts in a real equation. It's the real equation that he uses from Bayes' theorem, but Bayes' theorem is based on figuring out what the final probability is based on a pre-test probability. So basically saying like, let's figure out what the pre-test probability is. So what is the probability before we do any analysis? And then we'll put those numbers into an equation, and then we'll get a post-test probability. That's a very terse overview of Bayesian analysis. Now, what Richard Carrier does, though, is he figures out quantifiably what the pretest probability is, but he uses his own numbers that he generates based on his own qualitative assertions to create numbers. So essentially, he's pulling numbers out of thin air. So this is a really huge problem with his application of Bayesian analysis, and it's totally, wholly illegitimate. At best, this is a pastiche of Bayesian
Wholly
analysis. I'll quote briefly
illegitimate.
from Bart Ehrman because he mentioned that Richard Carrier's use of Bayesian analysis is like bringing a tank to a knife fight and then not knowing how to drive the tank.
Sounds like you guys didn't read the book.
And I would argue that what Carrier does is he brings a bicycle to a knife fight, and then he doesn't know how to ride a bicycle. So it's essentially
He's even dumber.
a really deep problem. And essentially what I'm saying here is Carrier's use of Bayesian analysis is predicated on him using numbers that are assertional. Now, they're real numbers, but as far as I can tell, there's no justification for the numbers that he uses other than his own qualitative assertions. And that totally obviates the point of doing statistical analysis. Why even use statistical analysis at all if you're not going to do anything that's quantifiable? If you're just
That question is answered in a book called Proving History. It's a good question, though.
underscoring your own assertions that are purely qualitative, why even use statistical analysis? It totally, makes the whole point of statistical analysis moot. All right, that's enough on that point.
No, it doesn't. I mean, for many reasons, using this kind of it's kind of Bayesian as far as I understand, and this is the part of this whole thing that I understand the least. But as far as I understand, the Bayes theorem is more of a personal. It is personal for you. Like, you're supposed to go through and you can slot in your own numbers. He does his own numbers, and he asks you to do, well, not ask you, but enables you to do your own numbers. And what the theorem does is, it makes it so we can't get away from what the natural conclusions of what our own beliefs would be, if that makes sense. Because there can be like cognitive bias, where we have a feeling that our beliefs are stronger than they are or weaker than they are. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that too much. But again, these are things that you would know, even if you disagreed with them. These things you would know if you read the book.
Now, just a couple of more problems with Carey's analysis in general. His bibliography is really atrocious. The reason why is he doesn't cite the main papers in his field. In fact, he kind of skips over a lot of the main papers. He also doesn't cite primary research. He goes to secondary and tertiary sources. So in other words, he's skipping a lot of the important primary research, and he relies on other people's summaries of other pieces of research. So essentially, he develops quotations that are sort of more removed from the primary body of research. Now, this is a common mistake among people who are early graduate students or people who haven't done a lot of research, where they realize that they really have to go back to the primary sources. This is something that actually you find commonly in the literature,
I don't
but I would say
agree
it's
with
particularly
this,
egregious in
but
Carey's bibliography.
you also
another problem with Carey, and
I don't agree with this, but you don't actually give any things or evidence of this, so asserted without evidence.
The last few of these because I don't want to make this video too long. I do have many other problems that I could talk about. But another significant problem is that a lot of what Carrier does is he disputes individual sources, like he disputes Josephus, he disputes Tacitus. He says you can't rely on any of these other sources, and then he advances the ascension of Isaiah. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't give you a clear reason why the ascension of Isaiah should be accepted rather than other sources. So
he doesn't do that. You should accept all the sources, but accept them as the evidence that they are. He doesn't. You can't throw. Also, he doesn't put forth the ascension of Isaiah as gospel. It's just, it shows you early Christians believing in this. But anyway, I feel like I'm looping in my head. I'm about to go crazy.
One source which is non-canonical, not part of the apocryphal literature, and he says this is the key source that we should be evaluating in our perspective, but he doesn't give you a reason why you should accept that key source while you reject all the other sources. So here's what would have been a better approach for Carrier to use. What he should have done is in the first part of his book, he should have said, this is the criteria whereby you should accept or reject a historical source.
That's what this is about. That's what this goes through. This goes through rules that we should use. 12 rules of historical method. Then it goes through all the reasons or all the ways we use to look at biblical texts, like the criteria for embarrassment, or C or EC or whatever. And it goes through the good ones, the bad ones. Fully does it. Yeah, this would have been a better methodology if you would have read the book. We did all of this stuff
in the knowledge base about Jesus. So here's the decision criteria. Let me lay that out for you, and let me show you why these pieces of literature that I select meet this criteria and why these others don't. And he also would need to have established...
That's what his whole book is about. I actually don't understand
how he would validate that decision criteria. But again, what he does is instead of that, he just disputes a lot of sources, and then he says, but this is something that you should accept instead. But there's not a real reason why you should accept the sources that he says that you should accept, and why you should refute the sources that he says you should get rid of. So in other words, he doesn't sort of establish any basis for that other than...
He has established a lot of, and you can disagree with him, and you could argue why this source you should be able to, but every single source he argues against or for, and it makes it very, very clear.
And, he's accepting, of course, the sources that support his own argument and his own analysis. The last thing that I want to say, because it is an important point, is that Carrier often has a very strained, nuanced, or idiosyncratic reading of things in the New Testament. I'll just give you one example. There's many, many examples. But Carrier, for instance, will say, Well, a lot of people have this analysis that James is the brother of Jesus. We find that in Josephus, we find it in the letters of Paul, we find it in the New Testament overall in the Gospels. So Carrier will say, however, that anyone can be a brother of Jesus, and this is really more of a metaphorical brotherhood. But then it doesn't really make sense, because then why would James be treated so differently by those other authors? In other words, if anyone can just be a brother of Jesus, why is James kind of put in a different category by the people who are writing about James? Why do they specifically call out James's biological relationship with Jesus? It doesn't make sense. Now, again, Carrier could have avoided this vicissitude, but near as I can tell, he doesn't do this. And the problem is he just advocates for his
Near as you could tell, he doesn't do this. He clearly describes why, but yeah,
very
whatever.
strained, very nuanced, very idiosyncratic interpretation of things without first justifying that interpretation. One last problem with Carrier, by the way, is although his work is very disputational, it disputes a lot of sources, he never establishes why the mythicist perspective should be the default perspective. So in other
I don't think he believes that necessarily. Well, he's not trying to change. Well, I can't. I'm not going to talk for him. But even he gives it in his book. I think gives it a 1 in 3 chance that he was like. There's still a good chance that he could have been historicist or historical. Like he doesn't rule it out. He's not. Whatever.
words, he's arguing against all these pieces of literature from antiquity, but he never establishes why, if you don't believe in those pieces of literature, you should therefore default to the perspective that Jesus was mythological. All right, so those are a few problems with Carrier's analysis in kind of a bit of a nutshell. I have many more that I could go into, but there's a lot of problems with the arguments that Carrier makes. Hey, everybody, I'm adding some additional thoughts as I'm editing the video, and this is kind of an important idea, so I hope this isn't too jarring, but I wanted to put this in. Usually when we have a theory that recontextualizes historical events, what we look for as an attribute within that theory is a better explanation of what's going on. So
ooh, it would almost be cool if he had a better explanation. He does. He clearly does.
That's what the whole book ultimately is really severely lacking, is it doesn't explain anything in the New Testament or in the history of early Christianity or in the rest of history that we understand with any better explanatory power. Okay.
I'm just a lay guy. I'm just a dude. I work in retail. It seems perfect. It seems a perfect explanation of all the evidence.
Okay, in other words,
or close to perfect.
It still leaves all the loose endings that we already have in history. Moreover,
more perfect.
It creates a bunch of new problems that are then very hard to explain. For instance, why did this idea originate to take somebody who's a mythical character and start lying about them and say that they were actually a human being who lived? What's the incentive for having that change in strategy?
And again, if you read the book, you would know this. You just know this. I can't. Nowhere in this book or any of these books does anyone need to lie about anything. He does not. He does not. It requires no lies. You can see this in Paul talking about milk for babies and food for adult people or whatever. Like there's an inner teaching and an outer teaching. This is very common. Earlier I said I had a history in the occult. I've been part of different occult groups or whatever that, as you move up, you kind of get to know the real teachings. And this is super common at the time. It's literally in the earliest text talking about inner teachings and outer teachings. And no one would have to lie. It requires no malice, just time. And it's almost like religious evolution, and that the religion that can replicate itself is the one that wins. Like similarly to why my dog's going crazy back here. Similarly to why the version of Christianity that won out was the one that you didn't have to become a Jew, is that it had more people there, so the version that won in Christianity was the one that historicized it, because even in Paul's in my paradigm, Paul is teaching people that the lay people in Paul's paradigm was teaching them that he's a historical person, and then it wouldn't be till later that you would find it out. And so it would only make sense that the one that won the day was the one that could speak to more people. Anyway,
Moreover, if there was such a cabal, an internal conspiracy to tell people that Jesus was real when he was in fact just a mythical character, why didn't somebody expose that at some point in Christianity? I mean, at some point, a lot of these people were willing to die for that lie. People are willing to die for things that they believe are true that aren't true, so people are willing to die for falsehoods, but they aren't usually willing to die for things that they are lying about themselves. Moreover, if you're living in
I do agree with that. I think that's super weird that people say that you can't, people don't die for stuff they know is lies. Or it's like, okay.
first century Judea and you want to get rich, and you want to ingratiate yourself to the Roman Empire or to the Jewish leadership at the time, you're just going to say like, yeah, I'm aware of the fact that Jesus was a totally made up character, and I'll attest to that. And that person would have been very ingratiated to the Roman Empire. It'd be a great way to get rich quick at that time. So it's hard to imagine that nobody would have sold out the rest of this little internal cabal to make up a story that there was a mythical character and just lie about that mythical character and say,
Yeah, and nobody needed to lie. No, we don't think anybody lied. It's not a part of the mythicist paradigm. You would know that. Moving on.
that he was actually a personal being who actually lived. So in other words, Carrier's ideas don't just have less explanatory power than all the theories that we already have. In fact, they have a much lower explanatory power because they essentially create a bunch of new problems that are then very hard to reconcile.
Hard
All right, back to the
disagree.
video. Now, I want to turn my attention,
fine.
however, to talk about what are other things that other historical scholars say about Carrier's arguments. So
I bet they
let's
say
talk about
he's
some
a
other statements from other historical
dummy.
scholars. Again, the fact that Carrier's book on the history of Jesus is sort of an intellectual dead end in the scholarly literature is a testimonial in and of itself that there's not a lot of room to add on to this body of work.
Intellectual dead
It's sort of
end.
intellectual cul-de-sac.
That's
essentially.
such a
So Bart Ehrman wrote about Carey, and he writes quite accurately, and I agree with his
Sick
statement. He's not a
burn.
scholar in the field. He has no position in a university or college. He's never taught Greek or New Testament or early Christianity, and has no academic access to any of the necessary tools of scholarship. So again, for somebody to be a junior faculty person, which is what Carey would be if he even had a faculty position, and not have any mentorship pathway and not learn about the proper technique of research, results in a very problematic work, which you find in On the Historicity of Jesus. I think Bart Ehrman makes this point. And again, Carey he's never been a professor. He's never had an academic appointment. He's never even had a university affiliation of any sort. All right, here's a quote
And I heard he liked the new Ghostbuster movie too.
from Daniel Gelada, who wrote a really good review article. Gelada, by the way, is a professor at Oxford University. Carey's treatment of the evidence is deeply flawed. His use of Bayesian reasoning is subjective and circular, and his readings of ancient texts are strained. Ultimately, Carey's case is filled with unjustified speculation, questionable methodology, and a lack of engagement with existing scholarship. Here's another quotation from Maurice Casey from the University of Nottingham. Carey's ignorance of ancient languages and Jewish context is breathtaking. His book would never have passed academic review in any reputable university department. Richard Carey represents the very worst kind of pseudo-scholarship dressed up as academic rigor. Here's one last quote from Larry Hurtado with the University of Edinburgh. Carey's Jewish mythicism is an extreme case of amateurism masquerading as revolutionary theory. There's other quotes that I could have put in this video, but I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I don't want the video to be too terribly much longer. Now, I do want to put in two important points that I think are really important as an overview perspective about Carrier, but these are two important points that I wanted to add on that are, I think, important points to emphasize. Number one, as most of you know, I was a rather hard-boiled atheist for almost all of my adult life. When I first got into the study of Jesus, that's when I encountered Richard Carey's arguments. And this is particularly the reason why I think this set of arguments is pernicious, because I think as an atheist, Jesus as a mythology is much easier to swallow. And I think that's the reason why Carey's arguments have gained such a wide audience. It's not because they're based in any validified truth. It's because rather that I think if you're an atheist and you read that Jesus is a myth, then you can kind of dismiss the morality of Jesus, and you can dismiss all the lessons of the New Testament much more easily. I think that is the most seductive thing about Carey's analysis, and I think that's why he's gained such a large following. I think it's just
That's not necessarily true. Like I said before, everything, all of Jesus's followings or teachings can be just as important to you, and none of you. I mean, it feels like it loses none of the, or little, or it doesn't lose all of the importance. Maybe some of the later written stuff and Luke and Revelations and John or whatever, but yeah.
important overview point to mention. The last thing that I want to say in this video, which is very important, is I think Carrier is an excellent case study in the dangers of working in your own intellectual isolation. Jesus said in the New Testament that if you meet with other people with the intention to study the lessons of Jesus, then that's a valid good thing to do. I'll put a quote on the screen where Jesus says that in the New Testament. He says, when two or more people are gathered in my name, my presence will be there. I think we live in a society right now where we are tremendously.
So Carrier should have not created an intellectual dead end, so he would have had friends
isolated.
gathered together.
Intellectual communities are really siloed off, and those silos are getting smaller and smaller, especially because we live in a society where we sort of potentiate our own echo chambers with social media. And I think Carrier really represents a really excellent case study in what the endpoint of that intellectual isolation is you create essentially a cul-de-sac where the only person who will cite your own work is yourself. I think it's a dangerous way to be, but it's a danger that we all face with an increasing likelihood as, again, academia gets more and more siloed off, and as intellectually we live in echo chambers that are more and more narrowly defined. So I think this.
Well, as Carrier says, on a recent interview I saw, I think there was maybe 10 scholars or experts in the field that agreed with him when he wrote this book. 10 years ago, and there's like 30 now. So there's nowhere approaching consensus, but there's a large, well, not large. There is it is growing, and there's even more than that that are starting to believe at least it. There is a point to it with mythicism. Um, but again, yeah, we all thought the world was flat at some point. You got killed for it, but that's why you should not attack people with their arguments. And that is the danger. So I think the danger is, yeah, or that's what it feels like. The lessons of this video is that if you don't agree with someone, or you can look for things about their person to give you reasons why you can dismiss everything that they're saying without grappling with it. Because I'll admit, yeah, like as a Christian, like I don't know if you have a lot of. I'm not sure if there's much to be gained from grappling as a Christian with this kind of stuff. I think it, well, you know, with personally my Christian friends I talk about this stuff with, I think there is, and I would say, you know, I think it's fun. You get to learn more about the Bible. You get to say, or at least other paradigms of what could have happened or what, but yeah. But I don't know. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Is danger, not just for Carrier, but for all of us. And we all have a lesson that we could learn from Carrier's example. All right. Again, thanks very much for watching to the end of the video. A few things I just want to add on to the end. Again, thanks very much. Thanks to the person who sent me Carrier's 2 books. I thought this was a very interesting read. Definitely not something that I would base my theology on personally, and definitely not.
And I'll also wrap up here. Yeah, I appreciate the video. I'm sorry if I'm like maybe dismissive or something. I've never done a react video like this, and so I'm talking like I'm talking to my buds, in kind of maybe a little unserious way. Don't take offense. I'm not trying to make fun of you or anything like that. And I'm also not trying to change your beliefs, but I just I don't know. I want. It feels like sometimes we're not all like at least looking at the same. I don't even know how to say it, but it seems like we're all looking at the same evidence, but like coming up with different things, which is normal. You would expect that, but yeah, I don't know. But if you've reached this far, it looks like I'm an hour 20 minutes in. Thanks, and I'll just let this video
something that
play
I think is academically a rigorous work, but it was an interesting thing to read Carrier's books. I think from reading from a very neutral perspective, there's just not a lot of merit here. There's not a lot of intellectual scrupulousness here. There's not a lot of academic rigor in Carrier's analysis. But don't forget, please like this channel. That would really help us out. I'm really glad that you watched to the end of the video. So if you have watched to this point, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. That's also really important for our channel's well-being, especially as a small channel. That really helps us out. Please comment on this video. I will respond to each and every comment that I see on this video. And please click the bell icon for notifications. Well, thanks very much for watching all the way to the end of the video.
I'll also say I thought it was funny. Gnostic Informant is on here saying, "Man, you got him, dude," and History Valley's also on here saying, "Put him in his place," which I just think is funny because History Valley is constantly having. I don't know. I don't know his beliefs on it, but he's constantly having the lady that doesn't believe Paul even existed. So it's interesting that everyone wants to dogpile on what Jesus doesn't exist. That's crazy. But Paul, yeah, that guy. Anyway, all right. Peace.